Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. Today we'll be discussing ES metadata and job ticketing. For those of you who are new to our GoToWebinar series, if you need to control the size of my screen or the scaling, there is a zoom button in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window. There is also a Q&A area in the GoToWebinar control panel where you can type any questions that you might have. If there's anything that's particularly pertinent to something I'm discussing, I may pause to address it. Otherwise, we typically address questions at the end of the session. This is a part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. If you go to our website at blanchardsystems.com/events, we have a full list of all upcoming events, including these webinars. Typically, as soon as we know what we're doing for the next month, we'll put the information up there and you'll have the ability to register there as well. So today we're going to be discussing, as I mentioned, metadata and job ticketing. We'll be talking about understanding the XMP metadata standard, using advanced metadata properties, creating rule-based job ticket layouts, synchronizing file and project metadata, and lastly, using metadata to drive workflow. This is focused on being very much a broad overview to show you the breadth of what you can accomplish with metadata and job ticketing ES. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, so I may gloss over some of the more technical details so we don't get too down in the weeds. If there's anything I gloss over that you want more information on, feel free to drop me an email and I can send more information your way. So to understand how metadata functions within ES, it's important to understand how metadata was implemented within the application. ES builds on top of the XMP metadata standard, which is an Adobe created standard for generally graphic design or just general metadata. It's an extensible platform, XMP, meaning that Adobe has a lot of their own metadata they've created or own templates for this metadata they've created, but you can also create your own. It is extensible, which means that you can use this in different applications. So for example, you might have metadata that you're entering in Photoshop, which uses the XMP standard. For example, I have a document over here, just a standard Photoshop document. If I go to File Info, you can see I've got all sorts of information here about this document. It is all XMP, so I could take this information, if I upload this file to ES, it would be able to parse all that information and run with it. Conversely, if I set information in ES, I can later use that in other applications as well, presuming I write it into the final ES file that I'm sending out. And since XMP is based on top of the XML data standard, it's fairly easy to parse in an application, even if that application doesn't support XMP specifically. So the one flip side to this is that XMP is very rigid in how it's defined. So there's a lot of terminology in ES related to metadata that might seem somewhat obscure if you haven't seen it before. So really how this works is metadata is organized first off into what are known as metadata sets. Metadata sets are groups of related metadata. So you might have metadata that's related to one specific customer. So maybe you've got a set of metadata for Demo Corp, and then you've got all sorts of other information relating to Demo Corp contained within that set. You might also have perhaps something related to specific product line. Maybe you do direct mail and you have a bunch of metadata that's very specifically related to direct mail. You might make your own direct mail metadata set to store all that. Within the metadata set, what you're storing are properties. And properties are specific pieces of data that you're collecting. So for example, that might be a purchase order number, it might be the name of the ICC profile you're going to be soft proofing with, the printing location where this is going to be produced. Those would all be examples of metadata properties. And there are different types of metadata properties you can use, or different data types to store those properties, which we'll be digging into in a little bit. But that's basically a good 1,000-foot overview of how it's organized. Within ES, that metadata has a further scope attached to it. Metadata can be attached to a page, it can be attached to a project, It can be attached to a batch of files that have been uploaded, or it can be attached to a workflow. And that's usually controlled by placing those metadata properties into what's known as a job ticket layout, which basically gives you a graphical interface you can use to assign that metadata. So from that job ticket layout, you could attach to, for example, a page or to a project, and you can have actually, in fact, different copies of that same metadata property set differently at different levels. So a page might have a purchase order number of its own, while the project has a separate purchase order. So those can be configured separately. Now, as far as setting this metadata in ES, you have several real options. Perhaps the most straightforward is job ticket layouts. You can create a graphical interface which allows users to enter in metadata. You can also have metadata. For example, you upload a file that already has existing metadata. ES is able to interpret that metadata and automatically ingest it as long as it conforms to the XMP standard. And then lastly, you can also use workflow, as we'll be discussing a little later today, to automatically create metadata in a file or a project or basically anything, depending on certain events that might happen in the workflow. So that's about the basics of how this is set up. Now to crack the hood and take a look underneath. If you want to create this, the place you would start in ES is under this administration tab. You go to customization, metadata sets, and from there you can create your own metadata set. So what we've got here is, I'll go to one right here. We have a bunch of these created by default that ship with ES for standard metadata sets that are used widely throughout the graphic arts and media industries. A lot of these are the sort of things you might see associated with certain camera models or, for example, metadata that's in InDesign or Photoshop. So there's some pretty stock ones in here. And depending on what you're doing, you might just want to rely on those rather than having to reinvent the wheel yourself. But each of these has a few different components that need to be configured off the bat for that metadata set. You have to give it a name to define what it is. So I have a bunch of webinar-related metadata right here. You have a prefix, generally it's just a short kind of abbreviation that explains what that metadata set does. That's actually what's coded into the XMP metadata as an identifier. The name here is just really a friendly name for the ES interface. And then you also have what's known as a namespace. A namespace is essentially a unique URL that's used to identify that metadata as yours. These URLs typically don't point to anything on the actual web, so you don't have to host anything on a web page, but they're typically just a string formatted like a URL. So for example, I just have a generic one here that says ns.blanchard.com/webinar. The purpose of this is if someone else comes up with their own webinar metadata set, some applications can use the namespace to determine that those are actually separate and not treat them as one item. So that's one way that's really important for differentiating down the line in other applications where your metadata could potentially clash with someone else's. With that, there is an important note. It's always important to make sure that this namespace is unique. You don't want to have a case where you have two different metadata sets that have the same namespace, because that can cause some strange behavior within ES. But yeah, for example, this website doesn't really exist. I just put plansys.com and just a URL. And it's the same if you go to, for example, just a generic, I might have an Adobe one in here. If you actually hit that URL, it doesn't actually load a web page. It's just sort of a unique identifier that someone can say, okay, I know that Adobe made this. So from within there, you also have properties down underneath, and these represent different things you might want to collect. So for example, I have some here for maybe an asset type or a job ticket comment or a purchase order number. And those are pretty straightforward to create. You can just click the plus here to create one. You do have, and there's a few new options in here. If you're still running ES4, you might see a few new options in my system, but you can choose a name for your metadata property. So maybe I want to collect, what do I want to collect? Maybe we'll collect project description. And then you have the option to choose from a few different metadata types. And these are basically just different ways of storing different data. So there's a lot in this list. We'll be digging into them a little later in the webinar. And in fact, a lot of these are in here just solely to support the XMP standard. There's some of them, for example, like I think there's one here for length, which is used for storing units of length. There's no intrinsic benefit to using that within ES, but it's there in case you have someone who created files in another application, such as Photoshop. Maybe they used a length metadata type somewhere, and you want to be able to support it within ES. So it's mainly there for compatibility reasons. So the two you probably would be dealing with most commonly would be strings and enumerations. And strings are just block of text. They're just basically a bit of text you can enter in stuff in a text field, sort of like this. The other one is enumerations. And enumerations are, let's see if I can find enumeration here. Enumeration is basically just a fancy way of saying a drop-down list. So, and for each of these, you can define, for example, enumeration. Some of these data types have specific options that are unique to them. So, for example, since an enumeration is a drop-down list, I can define the drop-down options. So I could say I want this to be 1 and some other option. And then those would be what would appear in my drop-down menu as choices to the user. You can also choose a default value. So for example, if you want this to always come selected to 1 whenever it's first loaded in a new job ticket. So maybe you have this attached to a project and you want that project to default to this option. You can do that with the default option there. Those options do change depending on what you choose. So for example, if I decide I really want to go with a string, then I still have the default value there, but I can also choose some options about minimum and maximum number of characters and regular expressions. So you can constrain what users enter in here. So I might have a situation where I have like a job code that is only 5 characters, and it's always going to be 5 characters. I could limit that and say, well, this has to be exactly equal to 5 characters. Maybe it has to be equal between 3 and 5 characters, so that they can't save that metadata until it conforms to that standard. You can also add in a regular expression here that defines what that data needs to look like. So for example, maybe you've got a job number that has 2 uppercase letters, or a job code that has 2 uppercase letters, followed by 1 or more numbers. You could do something like this so that if they don't enter 2 uppercase letters followed by 1 or more numbers, they can't save it. This can also be useful for things such as collecting email addresses where something needs to have that at so-and-so.com or .org. So you can enforce and make sure that metadata is correct up front before it gets in the system. As far as other options here, a few of the new ones in ES5 are their controls for searchable, available in layout, and save in XMP. Save in XMP basically means you want to use it to actually write it into metadata when metadata is exported from ES. If you have a document workflow and you stick in an insert metadata tool, if this is checked, then that metadata will be inserted into the file. Available in layout simply means that this is available to use in a job ticket layout. You may want to hide some of those options so it doesn't get too cluttered if perhaps you are using some metadata just behind the scenes in workflow for driving the workflow logic. You don't actually want it to be something that someone can plop in a job ticket. You can uncheck it to hide it from those kind of front of house areas. And the last one there is really searchable. And searchable means it's something that people can search for. So when you're in the search screen in ES, you can make sure that if I type in a value that relates to one of these job numbers, it would show up or it won't show up. The search option does also control a few other areas where metadata is displayed. By default, if I click on a file and I go to this metadata tab under my right-hand pane, I can see all the metadata that's associated with this file. And that includes stuff in ES, and it also includes stuff from other standards. So here's some stuff that was put in by InDesign when I created this test file. If you don't want stuff showing up here, you can just uncheck that searchable option, and that won't show up to users on the front of house area. It is important, and you can do that either for individual properties or you can do that for the whole metadata set as a whole and just kind of mass check or uncheck each of these options. I think there is a bug in here right now, just fair warning, where if you make at least one of them searchable, then they all show up anyway. But we have a ticket in with Dalim on that. Uh, Also, one other important note on that too, whenever you change the searchable status for some of these, it's important to re-index your search database. ES5 uses the new Elasticsearch search engine, but in order to have this behave nicely whenever you make a major change to what's searchable and what isn't, you just have to go into System Configuration and click Re-index the search database. And it usually doesn't take too long. That might be something if you're concerned about a slowdown you might want to do at night. You don't have to do it right away, but this may not take effect until that search database is re-indexed, because it basically has to reevaluate everything it's got indexed for search and figure out if there's anything it needs to add or drop to that list. So then there is one other thing in here too, is translation. When you make these properties, because of the XMP standard, they basically have to have a name with no spaces in it. But you might want it to display a little more user-friendly. So what you can do is you can define let me see if I got a good example here somewhere. Got too many things in here. So I have one in here that says add barcode, but I have an English translation listed down here that just says it a little more user-friendly way. And you can have those translations from multiple language. Whatever language users have configured as their language in their account setup will be used, and it'll pull from that. So you can have multiple translations in there. So, and lastly, one other thing in here too is the unique value option. This is one you have to be careful with, but if you've got something that's very unique, like a purchase order number, and you can only have one thing in the system that has that purchase order number associated with it, you can click the unique value button to make that happen. You do have to be careful, because if you accidentally click that on something where you don't intend it, like a Boolean, which is basically just a checkbox, you can really bite yourself quickly. But that is an option should you need it. So we've talked a little about how these properties are created. I think next I'll show you how to create a basic job ticket. Then we can take a look at some of the different data types that are available. So to create a job ticket, you go to the job ticket layout area, you click the plus, and you've got some options in here you can name it. So maybe we'll make this Hello World. And the one thing you have to be careful with is this global option. If you use this global option, it gets applied everywhere. Otherwise, if it's not global, then typically what you need to do is go into, for example, some customer and edit one of your project templates. There is a layout tab at the very end. And what you can do there is you can click and add a job ticket layout just for anything that uses that project template. Otherwise, if you use global, it's applied to everything, which may be good if there's information you need to collect from everyone on the system, but can bite you if you have information that's intended for a specific customer, but you don't really want everyone to see that. You also have the ability to choose where this metadata can be attached. So for example, it can be attached at the document level, it can be attached at the project level, customer level, so pretty much just different locations in ES. So let's attach it to the project level for now. So we'll make a basic job ticket layout with 2 rows and 2 columns, and it gives us this little thing here. All our metadata sets are shown in these little folders on the right. So you can go in here and you can just drag and drop different things in. So maybe I want to add that checkbox, or maybe I want to add my job code option in here. Actually, I think that one was required. I don't want to do that one. We'll do maybe print location. Click Save. You do have the ability to control how these are displayed. So if you want them to line up real nice and neat, you can put in values. I think these are in pixel values for the label length and the length of the field. So for example, this portion here. So you can get those to line up really nicely. So if I go ahead and go to one of my jobs now, since I have this as a global ticket, if I go into my job ticket and move all the way over to the very end, you'll see we have hello world in here and we have our 2 items. Now, if I want to make this a little prettier, what you can do instead of using those tables is you can also use, we'll make this 1 row and 1 column. There's some object area over here. Drag in a field set. And a field set's basically just a friendly container you can use to have stuff display a little more nicely. Actually, let's make that 2 rows. And we can have 2 field sets in here just to be flashy. We can add a translation for these. And that way they'll show up with a nice little name over them. And then for each of these, I can set them so they have, for example, maybe this one has 2 columns and this one has 2 rows. And we can drag metadata into those. So maybe we'll have an add barcode down here. We'll put another one of those guys up here. We'll put this comments guy here. Now if we reload this job, I don't want to save my info there. And I go over to hello world, you'll see now it's organized a little more nicely. So for example, and you can change those after the fact. So maybe I want this to show up on both documents instead of projects. I can change that. Now if I go back to my project and click on a document in here, now this tab shows up for my document as well. I could have that set so it shows up for both or for only one of them. So I'm actually going to make that document, I'm going to make that non-global right now so that doesn't get in the way. Now next what we'll do is, let me not save that screen. I have one more real world sort of example of one of these configured over here. Because the real question with these is once you make them, you want to find some way to drive workflow. Actually, before we do that, I'll show you I have one with all the different types of metadata we've been talking about. So this is just examples of some of the most common metadata types you'd be using within ES. So you've got strings, which are just basically plain text, just a short amount of plain text. You've got encrypted, which are sort of like a password field. It doesn't show the user what's in there. It's important to note, I don't think those are encrypted on the back end. It's more just a display thing. You don't want the user to see what's in that field, but I don't think that's actually encrypted on the back end. Integers are just whole numbers. Floats are decimals, floating point numbers. Enumerations, as I mentioned, is a drop-down list. Open choice is like an enumeration with the one important difference is that you can enter in your own values if they don't exist. So I can just type in anything there if it doesn't exist in that drop-down and use it. So that's a little more open-ended. You got pretty straightforward date and time information there. A text field, which holds a lot more information than a string. It's more for large text storage if you just hold like a whole comment rather than just a short phrase or word. A Boolean, which is a checkbox. Now there are also 2 kind of quirky, these are ES specific. They're database-driven metadata options. There's one for output channels and there's one for users. And basically what these do is give you everything that your user has permission to see as far as what output channels are in the system and what users are in the system. And these are really useful, for example, if you have a quick workflow where at the end you want the user to be able to choose where the file is being transmitted to. You can just click one of these. Then all you have to do in your actual workflow when you have your output channel or your digital delivery step is reference this metadata and it'll point it to the correct spot to transmit. You can do the same sort of thing with the user list with emails. If you have to send out a quick email, you can use that user list in the to field of a digital delivery email. Now there's also some more complex metadata in here as well. There is bags and sequences. So a bag, and these are basically, I can just put in anything in here, but it's used for storing one or more values of just arbitrary metadata. So and I can remove those if I want. I can add new ones. And these are just strings here I use, for example. So just a bag of strings, but you can have a bag of anything in ES. So if you want a bag of encrypteds or a bag of integers or a bag of dates, you can do that. There's a thing in the setup where you define what that bag is made up of. Sequences are the same kind of thing, but you can also control the order that items are displayed in. So in case you have a situation where maybe you want to change the order of something, or if the order is important, you can use the sequence will allow you to reorder that at whim. Now one more, and this was one you have to be careful with, but there's something called structs. And a struct is basically just it's sort of like a pre-baked field set. You can have a property that has one or more properties linked to it. So this has both that string and integer in it. So when I create my job ticket layout, all I have to do is drag in that struct, and those both come along with it. You do have to be cautious about using these as the data is a little harder to manage in a workflow. It passes an array into the workflow rather than just individual metadata properties for each of those two items. However, there are some uses for these we'll be showing a little later in the webinar. So it's a pretty good straightforward job ticket. Now, for a real world example, I have one over here. It's just a basic job ticket which has some information in it. So I can set things, for example, like my job code. You'll see the little red squiggly here. It's unhappy with me because this doesn't match my regular expression I set up when I define this job code. I need 2 letters followed by 4 numbers, and they have to be uppercase. So like if, for example, I try to make this lowercase, it's unhappy with me. So you can force, if the job number needs to be a certain format, you can force that. I have a print location here. I have a product type. So I can choose if it's a billboard, if it's a large format, if it's a box. I can add a comment in. I have a bag down here for SKUs. I'll add a few of those in. And there's a checkbox here for customer supplied reference proofs. This is what's known as a Boolean. But let's say I want to drive workflow because we're just collecting data at this point. Maybe we want to use this to control workflow, get to some point where we can actually use it for something. So what we can do is I have a workflow set up. I'll pull it up in this other browser over here. Generally, if you're dealing with this sort of thing set up, it's easy to have 2 browsers open so you can navigate through the system a little more easily. I have a pretty simple approval workflow over here that has 2 approval cycles, design waiting for approval and pre-press waiting for approval. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Maybe I have a situation where if the customer supplies a reference proof, that's the only time maybe I need design to look it over and make sure everything's correct, but only if that checkbox is enabled. Then what I can do in here is I set up basically a simple little programmed link. And what this link does is I have it set to language Java, and it says it's basically looking at this metadata has customer proofs, that metadata property, in the webinar metadata set at the job level. There's about 4 or 5 different options there from my earlier slide. You can have job means at the project level, page order means at the page level, file bag means metadata from the time of upload of the file if you had a job ticket attached to the uploader. And then workflow would be if you had something like a user action configured. So this is just going to return that metadata. And since this is a Boolean, this is just going to be true or false. If you wanted to do this a little differently, we'll actually run let's actually run the file through. So I have that checked right now, so it's going to stop for that approval. I'll actually delete this one out of here. Let me dump in, I think I got something here. And you'll see that pause at the design approval. So if we actually delve into the workflow for that specific file, you'll see that it passed and went to it went to this design approval. It didn't go down here and skip straight to pre-press waiting for approval. Now, if we delete this, let's say that we don't want it to go there and we wanted to skip that. I just uncheck this. Now, if we re-upload, it's going to skip that and go straight to the prepress approval. So if we look at the workflow this time, it skipped over that one and went straight to prepress waiting for approval. So the one thing that, and really what I wrote could be written a little more simply. Basically, if you want to try and figure out how to reference this stuff, you have a very easy way to go in here. If you're looking at a workflow, you can just hit W if you have a file selected, or go to Workflow, Document Workflow, Show Workflow. This shows me the workflow for this specific running file. If I go to Workflow Log and Show Context, it'll show me all the metadata associated with this page. So for example, you can see here at the job level, I've got some webinar metadata set here. So I wanted to check something, for example, like Philadelphia, and see what the print location was. You can click this little I here, and it'll give you the code that you would need to use to set that metadata into a variable. So I can actually copy that. So for example, if I wanted to check and only follow that link if this were going to Philly, I'm not going to save this, but as I click on the wrong thing here, please bear with me a second. There we go. So instead of that, maybe we want to only go down that path if it's printing at Philly. So what this will do is give us a variable called MDT, and it's going to set it equal to the print location metadata in the webinar metadata set at the job level. Because remember, these can have different values at the project and the document level, for example. So I could have different print location metadata. I can have a file set to print at a different location than the job overall. So let's see here. Got the job. So what we do next then, if we wanted to evaluate this, is we could say if, and we could say Philadelphia dot equals, and we'll put in here MDT. Return true, else return false. So that would give you, if that metadata, this basically takes that from the job level, puts it into a variable, and then we're checking that variable to see whether it equals Philadelphia. And basically one of these links, if a link gets a return true, it's going to follow down that path. Otherwise, it's going to return false. Then it's going to go down some other path. In this case, this other one I have here, which says if no other link matches. So if it were equal to Philly, it would follow that. If not, it would go down here. There are, if you're dealing with things like bags, this is something, because we're running a little low on time, I'm going to gloss over. But if you need more information on this, just drop me a line and I can give you some data. But basically, if you wanted to deal with bags, those get a little trickier because it's not something like the enumeration where we just have one value. You've got a bag, you might have 2 or 3 or 100 values in there. So it's how do you deal with that in a workflow? And really the trick there would be you would have to use something called an array list. An array list, really, this code, I'll just put this up here, but if you're interested in this, just drop me a line and I can give you more details. But basically an array list is just a list of values you can push the information from that bag or that sequence into. And then, for example, if you want to use that to control workflow logic, you can check for things such as maybe I want to see what the second item in my list is, or maybe I want to see if there's something in my list that has in my list of SKUs, if there's a SKU that's 333. I could use those and then only go down a certain workflow branch if there's a SKU that matches. So, but that's a little out of scope for today. So you can also set metadata via workflow too. There's an option in here. Basically, we're using that same, there's that method context.getMetadata and context.setMetadata. So if we look back at, I think this guy we just edited here. Context.getMetadata is basically just a method that you can use to retrieve that metadata by defining what level you're looking for it at, what the metadata set is, and then what the metadata property name is. So there is another one I have set down here at the very end of my workflow called context.setMetadata. So rather than grabbing the metadata and pulling it into the workflow, you're using the workflow to set that metadata, potentially on a job ticket, so someone doesn't have to manually configure that. So I have one here that's going to set in my job ticket comment to say this is set by the workflow after approval. So if I'm going to delete this file because we messed around with the workflow a little. But there is a field in here in the job ticket, this comment field here. Once I approve this file to the very end of the workflow, it should automatically add a comment in here. So we'll go ahead and approve this. And if we go here, we'll see this is the data set by the workflow after approval. So some of these things, if there's a lot of information you just want to keep track of, but it's only pertinent when a file passed through a certain part in the workflow, then you can use the workflow to set this automatically so someone doesn't have to go in manually and configure that. So a few more things. I know we're running a little short in time, but a few more important things I want to touch on. So one other, when we're getting into types of metadata, another really cool one is taxonomy. And what taxonomy is, to really give you an example, is the best example I've seen is retail sites like Amazon. Taxonomy is a way of classifying something in a system, basically so that you can either define it. It's basically a way of classifying something within a set hierarchy of things that can either be more specific or more generic. A good example would be book genres. So, and this is the same thing if you go on eBay or other retail sites, it's the same everywhere. So taxonomy usually starts with there's some overriding thing you're classifying. In this case, an Amazon site, it's books. Amazon, this portion of the site is devoted to books. So that's sort of what's known as like the root level of the taxonomy. Within that, you have other subcategories or child categories such as arts and photography books, biographies and memoirs, business and money, calendars, so on. So if I click into arts and photography, there's more information within there. So now you've got books, under books, arts and photography, and under arts and photography, you've got things like architecture, business of arts, drawing. Now you can have the idea of a taxonomy is it allows you to very specifically define how these things are stored, whether they need to be more general or more specific. It's not like an enumeration where you have a simple drop-down list and something has to be a hard type where it has to be sorted into one of these categories. Because, for example, with the idea of books, you might have a book that's an art and photography book, but it doesn't match, for example, architecture or any of these other categories here. A taxonomy would allow you to set that data, classify that data at the level that makes the most sense, whether that's very granular or whether that's more vague. So an example of this within ES would be if I pop out of here, we'll go into one of my jobs, and I have a simple taxonomy job ticket set up on my uploader. So what we could do here, for example, is upload a few files. I think I got some here in a folder. And maybe we'll upload, I've got a few different things in here. So I got some photos, we'll throw those in the system. And my taxonomy here shows me I can drill down. So right now I'm at the top level, it's an asset. Maybe I'm a company, I'm doing production on maybe a catalog or something, and I need to know what all these different components I'm uploading are going to be used for. So I've got an example here of this is right now an asset. I could say, okay, what kind of asset is this? This is an image. Now, what kind of image is it? Is it a photo, like an actual graphical image, more like vector or design content? I'm going to say these are photos. And I've got one other one here. I've got just a simple vector illustration. So I could say that that's a vector object. I've got one document here, which is a document, which it could either be in my case for what this customer, for example, is doing is they got print-ready PDFs, they've got text-only copy, because maybe there's just a rough copy that hasn't been fully designed yet, but I still want to keep it in the system. I can sort it at that level. But all these ones I've uploaded so far have been very kind of fine grain. Now, one other example would be maybe something like this album cover I have here. Maybe that's not really like a picture and it's not really vector. I don't know what it is. I can upload it. I can say it's an asset. I can say it's an image, but I don't have to drill down to that third level if it doesn't match. Like how we saw on Amazon, some of those books might be arts and photography, but not fit into any of these subcategories. So if I upload this, yep. Now I did have to do one important thing in the workflow for this. There's a branch up here right at the top, because when these files come in, that metadata is being set to the upload level for this file bag. So it's not associated with a specific file, because different things in ES can have different metadata associated with them. So what I have to do here, if I want this to really be useful, is I have to take that metadata and push it in, set that metadata at the file level too, because I'm saying it's relevant to each of those individual files, not that batch of the upload as a group. So I'm using this first command here, var asset type equals context.get metadata, file bag, webinar asset type, to grab that asset type metadata property in the webinar metadata set at the file bag level. And I'm using this one to set that same metadata at the page level. The benefit of taxonomy, like using taxonomy like this, is if you go to a search screen, for example, you have the ability to really drill down in your searches with this. So for example, if I decide that I really want to see only my photos, that'll show me my photos. Maybe I want to see all my images. I can click and it'll show me all my images with that tag. So that shows me both my vector, my photo, and my one just image that wasn't really as specifically classified. But you can drill down. So maybe I want to see those and I want to see documents. You can use that to really narrow down. If you're looking at a large amount of information in the system, you can use that to very easily drill down in a search without even having to know a file name, for example. That's one thing that can be incredibly useful. One other thing too, and then we'll get on to our grand finale here, forgot to mention earlier, is aliases. Aliases are another type of metadata property that can be used to basically change how things display for example, for different customers or different projects. So I have here under my customization metadata sets, we'll go down to my webinar metadata set here, if I can find it. Now I have an alias in here on one of my job tickets. And the aliases basically allows you to point to a different piece of metadata. So here, this one is set to point to something in the webinar metadata set that's named product underscore, and then this variable here just references the customer name. So I have two here for Demo Corp and Forms Inc. So depending on that same job ticket, depending on which customer I load that under, it's going to display different options. So if I actually pop over to here, if I look under Demo Corp and I look at product type, I have options for large format, billboard, and box. However, if I go under Forms Inc., I only have options for form and label. So you can constrain what options are available to users depending on what customer they belong to, or perhaps something about the project name. So a lot of flexibility there. Now the last thing here that's worth noting is rules. So I have here, maybe I make something where I want to generate proofs. I have a simple user action I built under the administration section called make proof. And I can define in here proofs. So maybe I wanted to send a Canon proof, a proof to my Canon that has the graphical color profile applied to it. But the real meat here would be, do I want to, and I can actually add multiples the way I have this set up. This is actually a bag, and the bag contains a struct. So the struct there's a proofer enumeration and a color profile enumeration, so two drop-down menus. I have those both nested within a struct, which is basically a group of one or more other metadata properties. And I have a bag on top of that saying that I can have one or more of those one or more properties. So a bit inception-y there, but I can say maybe I want to send to my HP proofer with foie gras, and I want to send to my Epson with US web coded. So you could choose and mix and match your options there. And then maybe in some cases you need to add a barcode to these before they go out to proof so you can track them through the production process. I have something called a rule set up here. I'll show you how it's configured in a minute, but I have this set up with a rule. So if I click this button, it shows me some options for barcodes. So I can say maybe I want a QR code. And hopefully this is going to work. I made a change right before we started the webinar, so fingers crossed. I have a network volume here that basically would simulate maybe printer hot folders in the network that this would actually be sending to. These are probably going to take a minute to crunch through. Twist, there we go. So you see we got proofs to each of our hypothetical printer hot folders. And you can see here it added some information about what profile it's using, file name, and what printer it's being sent to, as well as my QR code here. And you can see those are different for each of those files. And the way I have this set up, in fact, you can even change what, let's say I want to print this guy, or you'll go with that guy. User action, make proof. And I'll send this guy to just one printer. I can choose however many printers I want in here. So we'll just send this guy as swap to our HP proofer. And this time maybe we want to add a EAN barcode instead of a QR code. So I actually have one saved over here. So we'll select the EAN, type in this just enumeration, type in the value we want it to be. And we look, we'll see that popped up over here. We got a barcode. That was actually kind of a small file that used for this. So things got a little muddled up here, but you can see we got our EAN barcode instead of the QR code that time. So how this is set up, just to show you real quick before we wrap this up, under my metadata set, I have, actually we'll go under here. I have a struct in here, I think under, see if I can find where I got this. Okay, here we go. So I have two fields in here for just two simple enumerations or drop-down lists for proofer and color profile. Then I have the struct, which is basically just a grouping of those two. So it's taking just those two separate drop-down lists and associating them with each other. Then from there, I have a bag, and that bag is set to use, you can choose a subtype of what's in your bag. So you can have a bag of strings or a bag of numbers or what have you. But if you make a bag of struct, it basically makes sort of like a table or a spreadsheet with the elements in your struct, sort of like what we saw in that ticket where I could choose a proofer and a color profile. You've pointed at the struct down here, so I have it pointed to my proofer struct under my webinar metadata set. I have a translation down here, so it shows up a little more friendly on the screen. Now from there, all I did in my job ticket layout was I just stuck this into a pretty simple job ticket layout. I have a label here that says add one or more proofs below to explain how it works. You can access the labels in the object tab here. I just dragged in my proof bag to this area here. The one thing I did do to make it show up a little more nicely is I tend to hide the label for bags because otherwise it'll give you the name of the bag over here. And I made it a little wider and a little longer, so it was easier to read all the content in there. So I have that set up. I have my add barcode enumeration or Boolean down here. And then I have another field set I made over here that just has a type and a value for my barcode. So pretty straightforward. Now the one extra thing I did do here is I added a rule in. And rules allow you to control how things are shown on the job ticket. Basically, up front, you define what the action is. You can have it so that when certain conditions are met, it hides something. It shows something that was hidden. It makes something required that wasn't previously required. Makes something unrequired if it was required. So you can basically say, I'm waiving that requirement, or based on something you checked. Maybe you say you want a proof, then you have to choose a color profile, for example. You can even set metadata based on some of these rules. So you can say if a rule, like maybe someone checks a checkbox and it sets another piece of metadata somewhere else. You can even enable or disable, which means if you disable something, the field shows, but it's grayed out and they can't type in it. Value is for some of those if you're setting with one of these. Your target type is either metadata or object. So in this case, my target is that field set that contains my two options for my barcode. Then if you click on edit in here, there's an option in here where basically you're saying what conditions need to be met before this rule is applied, and it hides the field set. So I have everything in here set up so basically it looks in my make proof 2 layout that I'm on, and it looks at the add barcode Boolean. And if that's set to false, then it hides the whole option for choosing a barcode. So from there, I just have that set up and I have a workflow. And I'll pull up this workflow real quick. Proof action, just a very simple workflow. Files come in, there's a link that just does some formatting on the data it's pulling out of that struct so that I can digest it a little more easily in eTwist. And I'm just passing that metadata onto eTwist. I have some parameters configured. I have a simple eTwist workflow here, which basically just has a file come in, add some border around the edges so there's some room to apply the barcode. It forks based on the number. It splits into a number of processes depending if I have 5 proofs that I defined in that user action, it'll split into 5 different processes, set some of the values for those, and then applies the barcode and all the tag lines in emergexp, spits out a PDF, and then transmits the file to what in a production environment would be my printer hot folder. So the last thing with that would be how that metadata is being set. That metadata is being set, my workflow has a workflow layout attached. So my job ticket layout's attached to this workflow. And then this workflow is configured as a user action under customization. For more information on user actions, there is a webinar on our YouTube channel from, I think, last summer, which shows how to create user actions. Actually, no, it's from February 2016. It should be, there's a playlist in our channel. I'll actually have the guys, when they put this up on YouTube, put a link to that specific webinar if you want to dig more into user actions. But then I just have a user action that's set to run that workflow when you run it. So it'll automatically pick up that job ticket. I select my options, it sends it to Twist, and then Twist applies the watermark. So that's pretty much everything I had for today. I think we're running short on time, so I'm just going to take questions real quick. See if I can get this questions window a little larger so I can read.
Alex, here's one of the questions. And I think you had this set up earlier. Basically, the person wants to see how to edit metadata for an existing file. I think you had a document job ticket set up earlier. So basically select a file, and then as a regular user, be able to tag it or change the metadata values associated with it.
Sure. And we got a bunch of other questions here I can take after this one too. But basically, if you wanted to be able to edit metadata for a specific file, you can make some of those job tickets available at the file level. And then if you go into properties, right click on a file, go to properties, then you can change some of the settings. So for example, maybe I want the, I think I have a job ticket here I can use. Try to find one that's not too crazy. So this one, for example, if I make this global and make this document based, I can just go over to my file, right click properties, and then my job info tab comes up and I can type in whatever I want and edit it in here. So it doesn't have to be just for a new file. I can do that for a file that's already existing in the system. So,
and the thing to remember also, this is for the questioner, is that all those job tickets are customizable, so that can be any metadata information that you're interested in tracking or changing.
yep. So let's see here. Okay, as a user versus a developer. Yeah, as a user, you just be, I think that's the question you just brought up, Mike. But yeah, that's it.
That's the question you just answered.
Yep.
That's.
Yep. I need more coffee here. Bear with me. Okay. So the next one.
It's the same question.
Yeah.
The reason he asked it several times is because I kept asking him to clarify it. So he clarified it for me because I was too stupid to understand what he originally asked.
Okay.
Another question, though, and I think this was from earlier in the presentation. You had mentioned using the ES's insert metadata tool.
Yep.
And the question was, how does the insert metadata tool in Twist relate to that insert metadata tool that you mentioned that's used in an ES workflow?
Well, these are two different tools, but they perform a similar function. So basically the ones in ES, if I go into I think I have a basic document workflow here somewhere. So if I just pull this up and get my right-hand pane out here. So there is an insert metadata tool here. So the way ES works as of ES5 is all this metadata we're dealing with, it's saved into what's known as a sidecar XMP file. So these files, when you upload a file in the ES, it's stored in a location on a file system on the server. It stores the metadata alongside it. Previous versions used to store it in the database, but it's typically not pushed into the file unless you use an insert metadata tool. Then anything that would be checked, anything that's checked as save metadata when you're creating that metadata property would be pushed into the file as XMP data, so you could use it in Photoshop or Bridge or some other application. There is a tool in Twist that is also called insert metadata, but it's same kind of idea, but it's a little more manual. Let me see if I can find this here. Here we go. So if I were to drop this into a Twist workflow, for example, the insert metadata tool in Twist has the same kind of idea. You're still dealing with XMP metadata. It has a lot of the same things, such as the prefix and the namespace and the properties, but there are different properties. You can basically define how those are handled or when those are added to a file. So for example, standard XMP properties, let's see if we got any goodies in here. So creator, that would be one example. The one in Twist, you could say, I want to look at this file and see if there is creator metadata in here. And you can have it set a few different ways. You can have it set so that maybe you want to remove creator metadata if you don't want a customer to see who specifically was working on their file. You could use it to strip out metadata. You could use it to add in creator metadata if it doesn't already exist. Or you could use it to, for example, add metadata if you wanted to overwrite that every time and add in something specific. So the one in ES is for pushing metadata that's already been configured in ES into a file. The one in Twist is for adding that metadata to a file, but you're all doing it as kind of a one-stop shop, just because Twist doesn't have those extra management features quite the way that ES does, since it's more file processing than asset management. Okay, we got one more new one just popped in. Can a approver group be automatically attributed to a project via metadata if that approver group were embedded as XMP metadata in the file being uploaded? We do have a customer that's doing something like this, but it's not done directly in ES. Approver information, and just to point out what this guy is talking about is when you have a project, you have the ability to define approvers. So I have two approvals in my example workflow from earlier, design and pre-press. So you can define what this user is looking for is some way of automatically assigning these users on the fly based off of something in metadata. And there's no real way to do it directly in ES. The only way you can change these other than the interface is using the ES API, which is a separate module. But we do have a customer who's doing something similar to that, where they're using the API to basically grab information from, you could do it from metadata, you could do it from another sort of just plain text file too, for example, but they're using the API to assign those approvers automatically to specific files. But that's not quite within the scope of ES metadata and a job ticket. That's not something those tools could accomplish as it stands today. So I think that's about it. Thank you for attending. Keep an eye out for, hopefully have information up on the July webinar very soon. So thank you and have a good day.